Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. Today is Sunday, February 21st, 2021, starting at 2:33 p.m. in Denver, Colorado. So today I'm going to be talking with Yasmin Boland about the void of course moon and some of the different ways that the concept of void of course is defined. So, hey, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Chris.
So, you've been asking me for a little bit, for like a week or two, maybe, to do an interview for your show to talk about the void of course moon, because you learned and have been wrestling with some of the different ways that it's defined in ancient astrology versus how it's defined in modern astrology. And so we're recording this today as something that might do double duty for both of our programs, as just sort of a casual discussion about that topic.
Yes.
So that's part of the background. So let's first introduce you to my audience, if there's anybody that's not familiar with your work. So the moon is something that you really focus in on and specialize in astrology, right?
Yes. So I studied astrology like everybody else, maybe slightly differently. I had lots of different teachers along the way. I like to think I've had lots of amazing mentors. And I just studied astrology like anyone else does, and I had all the books that everybody else does. It was not that I sort of tuned into the moon, but at one point in my studies, probably about 2 years in, I was having a conversation with one of my very early mentors, and I said to her, what about moonology? And she's like, what? I'm like, what about moonology? And she said, and then she's quite psychic, this woman, and she said, but hang on a minute. Actually, I think that's a really important word for you. And I said, oh, okay. So I just kept it in my mind. And around about that time, I was discovering meditation and, chakras and all that kind of, stuff that people like me are interested in. And I came upon, firstly, I think I came upon the fact that women had traditionally done their magic spells at the new moon, which kind of fascinated me. And then I also came upon Jan Spiller's book, New Moon Astrology. And I felt like something that I hadn't felt for many years. I was a journalist at the time, really. And I just became obsessed. When something just grips you and you're just like, oh, my God. And I ordered this book off Amazon. It was back in the day. I was living in Bondi Beach in Sydney, Australia. And I just couldn't wait to get my hands on this book. And the whole thing kind of just went from there. And I started working with the moon. And as I don't think I've mentioned to you on air, I mentioned off air, my moon is conjunct my MC. I mean, it's like 1 degree out. It's really like, and now I look back and I think, oh, of course I do moonology. And that's the name of my website. I've also got a website of my name. But I registered the URL and it's literally just grown organically. I ended up doing some media astrology and everybody else was really into it as well, the moon. And, I personally think that the reason why this is all coming up now, the moon, is because I think that the divine feminine is re-emerging. And women have always worked traditionally with the moon. So I think, my publishers are like, wow, it's so great that the moon's so popular. And I'm like, I think it's part of what's happening in the world. I think it's, it's as tied into, what's happening in the world as the Me Too movement is or was, or, all this kind of thing is connected. So the moon has always been my thing and I just gravitated towards it. And I love the fact that you can teach people how to make new moon wishes, and we do full moon forgiveness as a way of working with all the emotions that come up with a full moon. And, and I kind of took out the astrology in a way and just left moonology. And so I've always paid attention to the void of course moon ever since I, first read about it. But I did not know. I mean, I did know about it, but I didn't know it was kind of, I knew about it, but I didn't know that people still used it. Or the video that I saw you doing on YouTube, it was very like it could be current. And I just became fascinated with the idea of talking to you about it. So that's why we're here, I think.
Okay, brilliant. So so your book is titled Moonology, Working with the Magic of Lunar Cycles.
And
it's been a popular book. What year did that come out?
Came out in 2016.
Okay.
And it's still in the Amazon astrology bestsellers.
Okay, brilliant. And
it's amazing. But I think it's the divine feminine. I don't think it's my book.
Okay. So why don't we define void of course as a concept then? So the moon has always been obviously a very important body in astrology. It's still a very important body. While in, early 20th century astrology, the sun, due to the invention of sun sign astrology, became more and more important. The moon, like realizing or learning that you have a moon sign, is like one of the first things that astrologers learn when they actually get into the subject. And more recently, it's been really cool to see that it's not just, people don't just know their sun sign anymore, but now it's common for people to know their sun sign, their moon sign, and their rising sign. So their big three. I think that's what most people call it, their big three.
Yeah, the three pillars, aren't they?
Yeah. So the moon's really important in astrology, and it always has been in different traditions. In modern times, one of the concepts that's been emphasized a lot, which is one of those concepts that's been popularized and almost has some, it's sort of like Mercury retrograde, where it's almost gotten some entrance or some penetration into like the public consciousness of like people knowing about it as a concept, even if they're not astrologers, which is this concept of Saturn return. Yeah. So Saturn return, Mercury retrograde, and then like void of course moon is one of those other things that's really been popularized in the past few decades.
Yeah.
So how do we define that? Or what's the starting point for what the modern definition of the void of course moon is and what it's supposed to mean?
Do you want me to tell you?
Yeah, tell me how do you define when the moon is void of course?
Okay. So the way I've been doing is the method that I learnt from good old Al Morrison, whoever he may have been, which is that the moon has made its last Ptolemaic aspect to one of the planets before it changes signs. And, from the time that it makes that last aspect to when it changes signs, it's void of course. And what's done when the moon is void of course will bear no fruit. It's a time, in my parlance, it's very much a time to just be. It's a time to meditate, and, it's just a time to just not start new things. In my case, if I want to bury something, I would always think, well, let's start it when the moon is void of course. And I have to say, after 20 years of working with this, I don't think it's let me down. So I'm really curious about how this system is so different to the original and what happened in the middle of all this.
Sure. So let me see. Let's finish just establishing like what the modern usage is first. So I've got a little diagram here that's not a great diagram, but it might suffice for our purposes of a little void of course diagram that I made years ago. So imagine a chart where it has like Cancer rising, and let's say that you have, for those just listening to the audio version of this, the moon is at 16 degrees of Aries. Mercury is at 15 Aries, the Sun at 21 Pisces, Venus at 10 Aquarius, Jupiter at 2 Taurus, Saturn at 4 Gemini, and Mars at 8 Virgo. Let's just say for the purpose of this that we're only looking at like the 7 visible planets or the 7 traditional planets, and we're only using the 5 so-called Ptolemaic aspects or major aspects, which are the conjunction, sextile, square, trine, and opposition.
Yeah.
So the moon in the modern definition that's been used in the past few decades is void of course as soon as it completes its last aspect that will go exact before it changes signs, I think is what you just said, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so if the moon's at 16 degrees of Aries in this chart, that means it just completed a conjunction with Mercury at 15 degrees of Aries. It recently completed a sextile with Venus from 10 degrees of Aries to 10 degrees of Aquarius.
Yeah, semi-sextile doesn't count.
Yeah, so we're not using minor aspects like semi-sextiles or inconjuncts, just the major Ptolemaic aspects. And it looks like the next aspect it's going to make is a conjunction to Jupiter at 2 degrees of Taurus, but it's only after it changes signs.
Bearing in mind for anyone who doesn't know that each sign has 30 degrees.
Right. So what that means is that there's this span of period of about 14 degrees when the moon is moving through after it completes that last aspect of conjunction with Mercury here, where it's not going to complete any other exact Ptolemaic aspects within the rest of that sign. And that's the period where the moon is said to be void of course.
Yeah.
And there's different ways you could phrase that, because the original Greek term was Kenodromia, which means running in the void or running in the emptiness. So you can kind of see how the modern concept is still very much connected with that, in that it's running in the emptiness because there's this empty or this void span of time towards the end of the sign where the moon is not completing any exact aspects or relationships with any other planets, basically.
Or is there?
Well, yeah, we'll get to that later, but just in terms of most of the time when you mention the concept of void of course, this is how it's understood by virtually all astrologers basically at this point in time, that this is basically what it means, right?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know if it was just me being ignorant, actually.
No, I mean, it's also in calendars, like I think in the Llewellyn calendar, it's marked. In most astrological calendars, it's marked. So you had said before we were in the pre-interview that you had originally learned this concept from, I think you said Debbie Kempton Smith, and she credited an earlier astrologer named Al Morrison, or Al Morrison, right?
Morrison, yeah.
Yeah. So, and what was Debbie Kempton Smith's book again?
Secrets from a Stargazer's Notebook. It's a great book for anyone who's just getting started.
Okay. So, and in terms of void of course, this is something that basically happens every few days, basically, right?
Yeah, I mean, based on this, really, pretty much, barring the odd moment when you've got planets right at the 29th degree or at 0 degrees, it pretty much goes void of course every single time it changes signs.
Right, towards the end of the sign.
Yeah, and obviously when there's planets at the end of, like Pluto's at the end of Capricorn, so we get less void of course time, like per week, say, or per month at the moment, if you've got, especially if you've got a couple at the end of various degrees of the different elements or whatever. But yeah, I mean, it means the moon goes void of course a lot.
Right, so anytime it gets towards the end of the signs, because it's basically just whenever it completes its last aspect in a sign, then the rest of its period in that sign until it switches to the next sign, it's going to be void of course.
That's right.
So symbolically, we can see that it's something that's associated with, having completed one aspect and not completing another until changing signs. And this notion of there being like endings because it's moving through the last part of the sign, or things that don't come about or aren't completed, aren't brought to completion in some way.
Yeah.
I think that's usually how it's interpreted, right?
I think of it as, slightly untethered, as the moon is slightly untethered during that period after it makes the final aspect and before it makes the next aspect after changing signs. I think of it as the untethered moon. It's a bit poetic.
Okay. Okay, so where do we go from here? I guess where we go is...
I have a question, actually.
Sure.
No, where were you going to go first? I was going to go to, I think one of the reasons why this is so popular isn't just the likes of Debbie Kempton Smith and Al Morrison. I think it's William Lilly. Because, when you look at horary astrology, this is basically the definition of the void of course moon that Lilly uses mostly, I think. Probably in Christian astrology there's a few, variations, because there's always variations to everything. But overall, in the practice of horary astrology, if the moon is void of course, nothing's going to happen. And generally, if you're doing the sort of astrology, the horary astrology that John Frawley teaches, for example, it's the moon goes void of course in this way, and after that you're in for nothing. And I just wonder if that's been one of the contributing factors to the rise of this method, or if it fell out of favor for another reason. I mean, I'm really curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely something that's primarily been used for the past few centuries as something that's primarily applicable in either horary astrology questions or in electional astrology, where you're trying to pick an auspicious chart in order to launch a new venture, where most of the time, ideally, you're trying to pick something that's going to indicate a successful outcome for you. And the void of course moon is traditionally something that's treated as a negative or problematic factor that will not indicate a very successful outcome, because the moon's lack of completion of any aspects in the near future is then interpreted as meaning that nothing will happen, or that the thing that was initiated at that time will not come to fruition and will not have a sort of successful outcome, basically, that nothing will come of it.
I do think you can flip that. and, say during this period, whenever you start will bear no fruit. Therefore, I have been known to get up at 2:00 in the morning and take my tax return and post it when the moon went void of course at 2 a.m. because, nothing will come of it.
Yeah,
Touch wood, in theory. You can use it both ways. It doesn't have, I don't see it as a bad thing. I just see it as a thing where it's like the world just takes a break. Everything just takes a break. So don't start anything really important there because it's sort of like numinous time. That would be how I would see it.
Right. I think that tax return example is a common one that astrologers use for the void of course moon, saying that they try to use that in their favor because they don't want anything significant to come from like the tax,
exactly.
Tax
return. There you go. We're all up there at 2:00 in the morning posting our things in the post box.
So that being said, one of the reasons why we're doing this episode today, it was partially just due to circumstance, but also one of the things that's funny, actually, ironically, is we started it here with Cancer rising in Denver, and the moon is actually, according to our definition that we're using, the modern definition of void of course is void of course. There, the ascendant just switched over into Leo. Let me back it up to where we started in Cancer. So, we have a nice little test of this today in terms of whether
if it ever sees the light of day.
whether our interview comes to nothing. We'll see. So the moon is at 26 degrees of Gemini. It recently completed a trine with Venus at 25 degrees of Aquarius. And it looks like the next aspect isn't going to be until it changes signs into Cancer, and then it will form a trine with the sun at 3 degrees of Pisces, right?
Yeah, but there is also, I think, within the void of course moon parameters, as per the medieval / Horary / Al Morrison module, is we didn't start this whole thing when the moon was void of course. I would have made sure that I did not send you the first email when the moon was void of course. So, I do think that that's something people have to take into account, particularly because the moon goes void of course so often, because you just get to the point where you don't start anything. So my feeling is that had I sent the first email when the moon was void of course, then presumably we would never have got this far. Now, the fact that the moon is void of course now, in a way, I think, well, that's all right.
Right. So let's see. So the void of course moon, one of the things, so part of the reason this has come up lately, especially in the past 10 years, and one of the reasons I started researching the history of the void of course moon was back in the 2012 presidential election in the United States. There was a lot of talk about how Obama was given the nomination for his political party to run again for the presidency in 2012 under a void of course moon.
The second time. But he was sworn in the first time. He took oath on the Capitol steps when the moon was void of course.
Yeah, back in 2009.
When he was first elected.
Yeah.
And then what happened? You know what happened, don't you?
Well, that was tricky because Mercury was also retrograde that time as well.
And what happened 3 hours later after the moon was no longer void of course?
There was a misspeak where the Supreme Court Justice said the oath slightly wrong. And so they retook it again like a few hours later that night, just in order to be extra cautious.
Yeah, but I always thought like the whole of the astrology world was a Twitter with the fact that Barack Obama was being sworn in the first time when the moon was void of course. And then what happened was, he flubbed his lines. How very convenient, because then 3 hours later he redid the pledge when the moon was no longer void of course. And many people say that he had an astrologer, because he always made decisions that vibe really well with the astrology. And he follows me on Twitter.
Okay. Well, that's actually kind of impressive. I did not know he follows you on Twitter.
If ever I heard it.
I was a little skeptical when you first started saying that, but I'm a little bit more intrigued now. But I always associate with that. And I thought most astrologers...
He follows 600,000 people on Twitter.
I mean, I'm sure you're the primary one that he pays attention to, though. But I always associate that more with the Mercury retrograde, with the inauguration thing.
It was all about the void of course moon for me.
Sure, maybe, but let me say my point first, which is that by 2012, a lot of astrologers were basing entire predictions on the fact that he accepted this party's nomination during a void of course moon, and a lot of people cited Debbie Kempton Smith's book, who said that for the last 100 years, anybody that's ever accepted their party's nomination under a void of course moon has gone on to lose the election. And she cited Al Morrison for this claim. And so at the time, I went back and researched this more, both Al Morrison as well as the void of course moon. And it turned out that he was actually one of the primary modern astrologers who was responsible for popularizing the concept of the void of course moon, and that he produced like an annual calendar that showed void of course moon times. And he also made some very striking and, I think, honestly, a little bit maybe not fully grounded claims about the void of course moon in terms of the political history of that, because we don't really have. One of the things I learned when I researched this was the claim that like anybody that had been nominated under a void of course moon over the past century would not be elected president. We don't have times for most of when people were nominated, because in the early 20th century, that's something that used to be done behind closed doors. And it's only in the past few decades that it's become a more public, televised process. Yeah. So I think Al Morrison was actually not being entirely truthful in his claim that anybody nominated under a void of course moon would always lose the presidency. And I grew skeptical about it, and I started studying the history of the void of course moon and realizing that there were different definitions of what even constituted a void of course moon, so that the traditional or ancient interpretation and definition of that may not have been the same as our modern interpretation. And one of the points that's worth mentioning again mentioning really quickly in connection with that, is indeed anybody who predicted that Obama would not be reelected based on the moon being void of course in 2012 when he accepted the nomination, a few months later turned out to be wrong, because he did in fact was reelected to the presidency. So that did not turn out to be a sufficient condition to base the entire prediction on. Which
I wouldn't take that as enough to base that prediction on at all.
Yeah, I
don't think the nomination is, again, going back to the point of when something starts. Yes and no. I don't. Sometimes the moon will be void of course, and in a process like that, that's probably got 50 different points where it begins. But the last point is the inauguration.
Yeah, there's a lot of things and a lot of different factors and things you can take into account that go into predicting an election, and a lot of different variables. That's a really good point. I guess I just bring that up as an example of how, in some instances, the notion, to me, that was the high water mark of going too far and too much hype being associated with the void of course moon, sort of in the same ways that sometimes astrologers, when a technique becomes popularized, like Mercury retrograde, for example, sometimes people can take it too far and they can treat it as the end-all be-all of, making predictions in astrology and indicate the worst case scenario every time. But that's often not the case. And often things are much more nuanced and there's a lot more going on than just like one indication. So part of my work with the void of course moon has been recognizing that there's different definitions and there's a lot of nuance and variation to it, so that it might be important to tone it down a little bit and at least not go that far and like basing everything off just that one consideration sometimes.
Yeah, I'm actually 90% sure, and we could double check, but I'm pretty sure somebody said to me, actually, the moon was void of course at Obama's second inauguration as well. And they said that was why, he didn't have enough, I'm not good at politics, but he didn't have enough people in the Senate or the Congress or whatever it is to pass all his bills. In the second, in his second term, it was quite difficult for him to get his bills through, as far as I'm aware. And people put that down to the void of course moon, that his presidency or the second term was very difficult because of that, and he didn't do his second flubbing of his lines because that would have just been pushing that a little bit too far. So but I'm curious to ask you something, if I can just flip the tables on you for a minute.
Hold on really quick, because there's a good way to wrap that section up, which is that you actually, part of your motivation for wanting to have this discussion recently is that this came up again with Biden, right?
Okay, I can say that now, but I'd also love to ask you something later. Okay, so True. So moving on from Barack Obama, funnily enough, because obviously the Barack Obama inaugurations and nominations got you interested in the void of course moon situation, which is kind of fascinating, because what got me interested in the Hellenistic void of course moon, the reason why I stumbled upon it, I actually knew about it because actually in my book Moonology, I had to do the 3 definitions of the void of course moon, but I knew that sort of the second one I gave was the one that everybody used. But when Biden was also now going to be sworn in under a void of course moon, which I didn't realize until about 24 hours before the inauguration, which really surprised me, because normally I suppose I rely on the chatter of astrologers to kind of, bring these kinds of things to attention. And all of a sudden I was like, hang on a minute, I've just looked at the inauguration chart. The moon's void of course. No one's saying anything about this. And I was really panicked because I was quite keen to see Biden sworn in, let's put it like that. And so it sent me off on this little bit of research, which, as I said, ended up with me seeing you talking about the Hellenistic void of course moon. So, I mean, I would be interested to know which one you use. Do you use both? Do you use one? Do you use the other? Or you don't use either?
So you're saying that Biden, in his inauguration chart on January 20th, that the moon was void of course, using that definition?
Yeah, it was. Using the medieval version, not the Hellenistic one.
We'll get into that because we haven't defined it, but that's what sparked your interest in researching this topic and finding out more about the history?
Yeah, because what happened was I saw you talking about this Hellenistic void of course moon, when the moon is only void of course, according to the ancient 1,000-year-old Hellenistic definition, that it's only void of course when it doesn't make a Ptolemaic aspect for 30 degrees. And apart from the fact I found it really hard to visualize when the moon might not make a Ptolemaic aspect for 30 degrees, I was just excited because I thought, okay, well, hang on a minute. Why did we chuck out this old version? And that's what brought this whole thing up. When did this become unfashionable? How can we all do this? What's going on? And that's why I wanted to speak to you, because I actually think you're probably one of the people best qualified in the whole world to talk to. So that's, tell us, Chris.
Sure. So, so I wrote, I've done a video on this, but my primary thing was an article I wrote for one of my websites, the Astrology Dictionary, where I went through and wrote an article talking about the different definitions of void of course and just trying to define the concept. Because one of the issues that I ran into is I found in the tradition at least 3 different versions, possibly 4 versions actually, of what it means for the moon to be void of course. So what we've just defined as the modern version that's been used for the past few decades. But if you go back 2,000 years to the earliest definitions of void of course, what's surprising and what surprised me and a number of other astrologers and translators over the past 2 or 3 decades since ancient texts started being translated from the Greek and Roman astrological traditions, is that there's a book of definitions that's attributed to an astrologer from the 1st century named Antiochus of Athens. And he has this one concept that he defines called Kenodromia, which is just literally, it means running in the void or running in the emptiness. And this is the exact ancient word that we get our modern term void of course from. But the problem is that when Antiochus defines this concept, he says that it occurs when the moon will not complete any exact major aspects within the next 30 degrees of its journey or of its course. So the next 30 degrees, and he doesn't say anything about sign boundaries also, it's not mentioned in the definition. So what that seems to mean, as long as we're interpreting this text correctly, and every translator I've talked to seems to interpret it the same way, is that it literally just means that the moon originally, in its original definition, was thought to be void of course if it doesn't complete an exact aspect in the next 30 degrees, regardless of sign boundary.
And in some ways that makes more sense, because if you think about it, it's all very easy for us to be working out when the moon is void of course every 2 and a bit days because we've got computers. But if you're an astrologer 2,000 years ago, it's quite a big deal to be working that out on a regular basis. I think it's makes more sense that they were a bit broader about it. But I find the whole thing fascinating. I mean, I cannot tell you how much I've been looking forward to talking to you about this, because it's so strange to have something that's stated. I mean, at the risk of sounding completely, unread, how seriously do we take his opinion? And did he invent the void of course moon, which then got changed?
No, I mean, it seems because it's mentioned in Antiochus, and then it's mentioned in Porphyry, and then it's mentioned in a later Hellenistic astrologer named Rhetorius. So it seems to have been relatively consistent.
Okay.
And one of the things that's interesting and worth mentioning here is, even though it's largely something that's used in a natal and electional, or in an electional and a horary astrology context in the later traditions, like in the 20th century or even in the 17th century in William Lilly, in the definitions here in the Hellenistic tradition, they're primarily for natal astrology. And there's actually interpretations for what the void of course moon means in the 4th century astrologer Firmicus Maternus, but they're entirely about what it means if a person has this in their birth chart. But it's something that's treated as very rare and something that's treated as very negative.
And that's 500 years later as well.
Yeah, I mean, Antiochus is the 1st century, and then Porphyry is the 3rd century, and then Firmicus is the 4th century. Yeah. So my point, though, is just that originally it was probably a natal astrology concept used in birth charts. It's something that only occurs once or twice a year, so it's a very rare thing for the moon not to complete any exact aspects in the next 30 degrees. And because that's more than basically 2 days, it's basically 2 days of the moon not completing any aspects, and therefore you can understand why it was called running in the emptiness or being void of course, having nothing in its path, because it's like a planet that has no relationships and will form no relationships with other planets, because you have to remember that aspects were conceptualized as relationships and means for the planets to interact with each other. So what happens if the moon is void like that for 30 degrees is it's kind of like an isolated or a lonely moon, you might say, that has nobody keeping it company, and therefore has no support and assistance from other planets or other people.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to find this list I made of people who have got the void of course moon using the medieval or modern definition. And I mean, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I'm 99% sure Winston Churchill, for example, has a void of course moon. It's like, well, you can't really say that guy's life amounted to nothing. Whatever you think of him, he's a figure in history. So, that to me, it kind of leans towards, okay, well, maybe the Hellenistic definition shouldn't have been thrown out quite so easily, And that's why I'm fascinated to know what happened to it.
Well, and I think that's one of the problems, that's one of the issues that I have with, because I think Al Morrison did popularize it, but sometimes some of the later modern astrologers, they would go back and read astrologers like Firmicus Maternus from the 4th century, when Firmicus would define and give you interpretations of the void of course moon, except he actually doesn't say how to determine it or how it's defined, but he does have a chapter on just interpreting what it means in a birth chart, and he gives these extremely negative delineations of what it means. And then the modern astrologers who read that in the 20th century thought those applied to the modern definition, which is much less rare.
Like mixing apples and oranges.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that's part of the problem, is we have to be careful sometimes to make sure when we're looking at ancient texts that they're defining things in the same way that we are, because sometimes we can actually misinterpret and we can mix things up in a way that could be problematic.
Totally.
So I'm trying to flip through a translation of Firmicus really quickly to find his definition of void of course, because it's kind of over the top, honestly, and but it gives you some context for how they defined it. So I just found it. So it's in Firmicus Maternus. This is the translation by Jean Rice Bram from like the 1970s. It's in Liber Quartus, chapter 8. It says, if the moon is moving towards nothing, if the moon is located that she is moving towards nothing, it is in aspect to no planet, and there is no benefic planet on the angles. This will make paupers destitute of all necessities, without means of daily life. They beg for a living and are always in need of a stranger's help to sustain life. They will always be inferior to their parents and their bodies sickly. They suffer from infected wounds and he actually goes on. It's like very not very
well, now
nice.
we have to look up Winston Churchill's chart and see if he had Jupiter on an angle, because he certainly doesn't fit for that.
Yeah, and that's actually a really important point, you noting that he doesn't just say moon void of course. He says if the moon is not void of course and there's no benefic that is angular in the chart, so there's mitigating conditions to even his delineation here right from the start. And that's another interesting, consistent thing that I found in the history of the void of course moon as well, is there can be mitigating conditions that you're supposed to take into account. And this is also true from some of the later definitions as well.
All right, well, let's have a look. I've got Winston Churchill's chart.
Do we have a good birth time for him?
Let's have a look what I've got here. I've got 1:30 a.m. On astrotheme.com.
Okay. Astrotheme is not reliable, but it looks like I have it as well, and it's like an A-rated chart from Churchill's father to the astrologer John Addy. So that seems
well. According to this, he doesn't have. Well, he might have Venus just about on his descendant.
We have an issue because his ascendant's really late. That's more of an issue for me because I use whole sign houses than it is for you. But his ascendant.
No, I actually use whole sign houses. Just this chart isn't a whole sign house. So let's have a look.
Okay, so here's the chart. It has 2956 Virgo rising with a 1:30 a.m. birth time from 1874. So honestly, it could be either Virgo rising or Libra rising. We don't really know, but it's actually really interesting that in this chart, this would be, if we took the Virgo rising chart, it would be a night chart with Venus angular in the fourth whole sign house at 22 degrees of Sagittarius.
So it is, yes.
Not too far from the degree of the IC at 29 degrees of Sagittarius. So even in the quadrant, it's getting kind of close. I have to find
my list of people born with the void of course moon, because I've got an extensive list of it.
Okay, so this would be void according to the modern definition. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yes, it would be. It's 29 degrees, so
yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
but you weren't using this as an example of the Hellenistic definition, though, right?
No, I was using this as an example of the. Oh, there we are. Oh no. I don't seem to have it. It's really annoying. No, I was using it as an example of void of course in the medieval version. But again, I suppose we're mixing apples with oranges, because the whole thing about the benefic on an angle is from the Hellenistic, is it? Or is it from the... Oh,
yeah, that's from Firmicus, from the Hellenistic tradition.
Yeah, from the Hellenistic,
But that's a good, just example in terms of reading from Firmicus and noting right away that there are exceptions. So he says, if the moon's void of course, and there's no angular benefic, because if there's an angular benefic, that's going to contradict some of those indications very strongly. Let me see if there's anything else that Firmicus says that's relevant and not super depressing. So
what about if it's in Taurus or Cancer?
That's a medieval mitigating factor, and we can get to that in a second.
Okay.
So attack their joints. Okay. He says they suffer from infected wounds or malignant humors under the skin.
Okay, let's not freak people out.
I'm not trying to freak them out. It's Firmicus, and he's very over the top, but he does say...
so don't freak out.
Especially if the moon is running through the vacuum, which the Greeks call Kenodromia, if it is in opposition or square aspect to Mars or Saturn on the first or third day, or if malefic planets are on the angles. So he gives another mitigating condition for if there's malefics that are angular and the moon is void of course, then it can be more problematic. He goes on and gives some other mitigations, like if the moon is aspected by benefics and other conditions. But anyway, the point of that was just he's delineating that originally within the context of a natal delineation of a birth chart of something that only occurs very infrequently, and that's one of the reasons why it was considered to be something worth noting, because I think I only saw the moon go void of course according to that definition. I think the people from the Honeycomb Collective Astrological Planner found one instance of it that happened last August, in August of 2020, but I think that was the only one for that entire year.
Yeah, there's actually, unfortunately, I don't have it on me, and I know I told someone about it. Someone wrote to me, there is a Hellenistic void of course moon calculator on the internet, And I looked at a few years, and it seems to happen, I would say, like, from memory, it was up to 7 times a year, but some years just had once or twice. So just to really get things clear in my head here, so according to the Hellenistic version, it's if the moon doesn't make another aspect, an aspect to a planet in the next 30 degrees, unless there's a benefic on one of the angles.
Well, let's just
in
say
a natal chart.
Let's leave the other mitigating conditions out, because that's more just like stuff that will make it better, even though it's still theoretically pretty bad. But let's just define it as the moon is void of course if it doesn't complete any aspects in the next 30 degrees, regardless of sign boundary, and that's it. And if you have that, then the moon is void of course. And there can be things that can make it better because it's not the end of the world and there's other mitigating factors. But for our purposes, it's that. So the site you mentioned, I think that's astroseek.com, or astro.seek.com, which is a really amazing website that's been really just kind of killing it over the past few years in terms of integrating a lot of great new techniques, both modern and ancient, and making like calculation services for them. So I just found the Hellenistic calculator that you mentioned on their website. I forgot that they had programmed this.
Yeah. What is it again?
So here it is.
URL?
It's Astro.
Yeah, that's the one. Oh,
it's
mooncalendar.astro, because I would have it in my my memories, my computer memory. There it is.
Yeah, so mooncalendar.astro-seek.com. So it has different options. So we're going to do traditional 7 planets, aspects, main aspects. I should actually have him change that to major aspects.
It's actually a brilliant thing to have this. I mean,
yeah,
Solarfire doesn't have this. They should put this in there.
No, I mean, and that's what's really great about Peter's website is he's been really responsive in integrating new things like this as they come out. He also did like a perfections module and a zodiac releasing thing, and he has a lot calculator and a lot of stuff. So under void of course method, he defines the different ones, and he has a Hellenistic one, which is a 30-degree orb for the moon. He says happens very rare, a few times a year. So if you click that, under 2021, it looks like there's just 2 that happen. So there's one on October 2nd.
I think that's it, actually. I think it goes void of course and then it stops being void of course on the 5th.
So, it stops on the 5th. Okay, that makes sense. So it's just one time in this entire year.
Yeah.
And that the moon will be void of course from 25 degrees of Leo to 27 degrees of Virgo, which is a really long span of time. And you can see why that, because usually there's other planets in different positions that the moon will hit an aspect with at some point.
Until I saw this website, I just couldn't believe it ever happened. I was like, how can this ever happen? And then I see, okay, it does actually happen.
Yeah, and here's the one for 2020. So it was from August 29th to September 1st.
Yeah.
And the moon's last aspect, I guess, was a square to Mars. And then the next aspect was a sextile to Mars.
The mystery to me here, Chris, is that how is it? I mean, like I said to you before, I was never a history buff. I didn't used to be. And then suddenly something changed for me. I mean, I lived in Paris for a few years and I was surrounded by this history and I was never interested. So I went to all the modern exhibitions and all that. I just wasn't. And all of a sudden I was. And now I think, okay, like this is queer, strange, like doesn't make any sense whatsoever that this thing has just been thrown out and it's been completely replaced by something completely different. Like it just doesn't make sense to me. Like how does this even happen? How do we get to the bottom of it?
Well, part of it is just that you have to realize that the history of astrology is extremely long. Like we're talking about 2,000 years ago. So we're talking about generations and generations of astrologers ago. And one of the things you have to realize is that the history and transmission of astrology over the past 2,000 years, even though it's relatively easy for us to transmit information today through like the internet or through books or blogs or podcasts or YouTube or what have you, they didn't have that like 2,000 years ago. But instead, for most of the astrological tradition, in order to pass on teachings, you either had to pass them on verbally from teacher to student through like an oral transmission or teaching, or more commonly, you had to pass them on through books. And copying a book in the ancient world, you actually had to like get the book and then have a scribe sit down,
literally write it,
and literally like copy the text over, and that's how a book was copied. Now, this was also complicated by the fact that over the past 2,000 years, it hasn't just been one singular language and one singular culture that's been practicing astrology all along, but instead we've had many different cultures that have practiced astrology and many different empires that have risen and then fallen during that time. And then astrology has been transmitted from one culture to another and translated from one language to another. And sometimes when you translate astrology from one language to another, the transmission is not always perfect. Sometimes translation, you can misinterpret things, or sometimes when you're translating an old text, it can be hard to understand exactly what they mean, and you might misinterpret what they mean and come up with an entirely different definition of something based on your misinterpretation. So there's a lot of different instances where sometimes that happens. There's other instances where astrology has changed, or there's been new techniques introduced, or even new planets introduced over the past 2,000 years. And sometimes that causes changes and innovations in the system that are more deliberate, but nonetheless, they still cause shifts in how things are interpreted. So that's part of the background of that.
And that does, because if you think about it with Pluto, say, for example, as a very modern planet, relatively speaking, I guess back in the day before Pluto was discovered, it was much easier for a planet to go 30 degrees without making an aspect, or before, all the Uranus, Neptune and Pluto were discovered. I guess if you didn't know they were there, then you wouldn't know that the moon was making an aspect to them. And you would consider that it was much more common. And at the same time, I would ask you, as a Hellenistic astrologer or someone who knows a lot about it, if we are to use the Hellenistic void of course moon definition, do we have to take Uranus, Neptune and Saturn out of the picture? Because, if the moon, you can't use the Hellenistic version and Pluto,
right.
Like one has to cancel the other out.
I mean, I think there is something to be said for a distinction, or drawing some sort of distinction between the 7 visible traditional planetary bodies that you can see with the naked eye versus the 3 outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, which are typically invisible to the naked eye, and that in most forms of divination, what a person can see with the visible eye and what you can actually observe, that there is a difference there, a conceptual and interpretive difference between that versus that which you can't see, or what's obscured in some way. So there might be a good reason why you might want to draw a distinction between using this within the context of the traditional planets versus incorporating the outer planets, because you also would have to draw a line between, if you're going to incorporate the outer planets, are you also going to incorporate minor planetary bodies like Ceres or Vesta or Pallas or other asteroids or other things like that?
I mean, I think if you're going to use the Hellenistic definition, which I'm quite drawn to, just because it was the first one, and you're the person who convinced me to use whole sign houses because you gave that brilliant argument, and also because Robert Hand told me to use them as well at an astrology conference. If you're going to use the Hellenistic void of course moon, you cannot use the planets that were discovered after the telescope, because it just doesn't make sense. Like, it's too different. So, and that presents me with a problem, because I do consider myself a modern astrologer. And when John Frawley tried to convince me to deselect all the modern planets off my solar fire, I said no, and I still say no, because they are there and we know they're there. But then if you're going to use the Hellenistic version, I think you do then have to say, except we can't count them then. And I just feel like the modern definition, or the Al Morrison definition, let's call it, the medieval version, I feel like that's kind of been made up, and that disturbs me.
Well, let's get into that, because that'll get us to our second and third definitions of void of course,
okay,
which we haven't introduced yet. So let's see, where do we start here? So going back to my article where I defined the different versions of void of course, I started with the Hellenistic definition, and that one was used for all the way through at least the 7th century CE, just the Hellenistic version of
until the 7th century. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, until about the 7th century, because Rhetorius mentions it in the 6th or 7th century. So it still exists then, basically towards the end of the Greek tradition, where astrologers were primarily writing in Greek and sometimes Latin, but basically during the Roman Empire. But by the time of Rhetorius, the Roman Empire is in full decline, and astrology is not being practiced as much in Europe and in the Roman Empire in general at that point. but instead we have around the 7th and 8th century, we have the advent of the Islamic Empire, and the capital at one point gets moved to Baghdad, and the rulers at the time, the caliph at the time, got together a group of astrologers, and they said, we want to found a new capital in this city that will be called Baghdad. Pick us an auspicious astrological chart for founding the city. And they did.
And when was this? Sorry?
Let me pull up the chart, because we actually have the chart survives from an Arabic writing historian named Al-Biruni, actually preserves the chart for us. So it looked a little bit like this. So it's set for July 31st, 762 CE, around 2 p.m. in Baghdad, modern-day Baghdad, Iraq. So it has Sagittarius rising with Jupiter in Sagittarius in the first house in a day chart. The sun is up at 10 degrees of Leo in the 9th whole sign house, which is probably important and somewhat deliberate. The moon is somewhere in Libra, although it's a little bit tricky because how we calculate the chart here, theirs may have been slightly different in terms of the astronomical methods that they were using at the time. Right. But I do think that they were trying to put the moon in Libra, where it actually would have been exchanging signs or in a mutual reception with Venus, which is in Cancer. Although it's interesting that, again, just connected with our topic, the moon actually does, according to the modern definition, would be void of course here. It's at 27 degrees of Libra.
What are the chances?
Yeah. So, but Baghdad did pretty well for the first few centuries. And after this foundation, it became like a center for not just the entire empire, but also for learning and commerce and philosophy and even astrology.
Civilization.
Yeah. So, and even for astrology. So, that's the chart for Baghdad. Where was I going with that? So the focus shifts to a bunch of the Arabic astrologers started translating texts from Greek and Latin and Sanskrit into Arabic. And at some point during this tradition or during some of the subsequent ones, because eventually after a few centuries, astrology was transmitted back to Europe, where the Europeans started translating text from Arabic into Latin. And that's how astrology came back into Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire in like the 12th century.
Okay.
So somewhere around this time, we get this new definition of void of course that we start seeing in different authors in the early and late medieval astrological traditions.
So from about the 8th century CE.
Yeah, from let's say the 8th century through the 12th century.
Okay. Amazing.
Yeah, I'm looking to see if I have a book here. I may not have it in this room, by my friend Benjamin Dykes, where he actually takes the definition. But go ahead and talk or say something, and let me see if I can find this on my computer really quick.
Well, I think the first thing I'm going to say is
do you have questions about the historical part?
Yeah, I mean, I find it absolutely fascinating to talk to you about this, because the history of astrology just blows me away. And to think it was 8th century that this void of course moon new definition came in. I mean, for one thing, it's such a long time after the first definition that you've told us about. I mean, we're looking at 800-900 years of the first definition, really, aren't we?
Yeah. So, and one of the things that's important that is maybe worth mentioning here is there was a new development in the history of astrology that started happening between those times, between the late Hellenistic tradition and the early medieval tradition in Arabic, which is the introduction, or at least the full-fledged starting to practice horary astrology questions, which became the fourth branch of astrology. So earlier in the Hellenistic tradition, they primarily had three branches, which was mundane astrology, natal astrology, and electional astrology.
Right.
But slowly in the Hellenistic tradition, there was this new practice that grew out of electional and eventually became a full-fledged fourth branch in the medieval tradition, where a client could approach an astrologer and ask a single specific question, and the astrologer would cast a chart for the moment they received the question and then attempt to answer the question just based on the chart for that moment. And that's what's known as horary astrology today. So that type of astrology, really, the first full text book on horary astrology uh, wasn't written until around 775. So some of the texts by astrologers like Theophilus of Edessa, Masha Allah, and Salah bin Bishr are some of the earliest complete works on horary that survive, and they're all writing around the year 775 or 800 or so.
Okay.
So that's important because
that is important.
In horary astrology, like how familiar are you with horary?
I mean, fairly.
So the primary.
Fairly. I know how horary astrology works. I don't know all the ins and outs.
Sure, but so the basic premise, though, of answering most horary questions, which I think grew out of the Persian tradition as well as the early Arabic tradition in the 6th and 7th and 8th centuries, is that what you do is the astrologer casts the chart for when they received the question, and then they have to identify. They always associate the first house with the querent or the person who asked the question. And usually the planet that rules the first house or rules the ascendant, the rising sign, that planet is thought to represent that person in the chart, right?
Yeah.
So then the other thing the astrologer has to do is they have to identify what house matches the topic of the question.
Yeah.
So if the client is asking about relationships, then they'll usually look to the seventh house. If they're asking about like their parents or their home, they might look to the 4th house. If they're asking about their career or something, they might look to the 10th house. And then what they do is they find the ruler of that house. So let's say it's a relationship question. So they look to the 7th house. They would then identify what planet is the ruler of the 7th house. And they would see if that planet is forming an aspect with the ruler of the ascendant.
Querent.
And if those two planets are forming an aspect that's still applying, then oftentimes the answer will be affirmative or the answer will be yes. Whereas if they're not applying to an aspect, or if they're separating or just not aspecting at all, then the answer is negative or is a no, right?
Yeah. And I mean, just for anybody who's listening, I think it's really interesting that one of the reasons why, as I understand it, horary grew was because back in the day, back in 700, the year 700 and whatever, when it was starting, when you were talking about, the average person didn't know when they were born, what date, let alone what time. I think you had to be a king or a queen to have that kind of information recorded. So I think that's one of the reasons why it grew up, wasn't it? Because then it was just the moment the question is asked and understood, and then you look at the chart. I mean, I like that idea because I'm quite a cosmic person, and I've always felt in astrology there's no such thing as a bad chart. So to me, horary astrology works, but is that when we saw the change then beginning? Because maybe it suited the horary astrology to have a different definition of void of course moon.
Exactly. And I think that's part of what starts happening at this point is because of that new approach to horary and horary becoming much more popular, that there were also some new techniques and new concepts that were introduced in order to be able to answer horary questions. Because if you're using that approach where it's only if two planets are directly applying to an aspect, and those happen to be the rulers of the two houses that match the question in the chart, then that's kind of rare that happens. So they had to introduce a few additional concepts at this time in order to make other situations where those two planets could connect, even if they weren't doing so directly. So at this time, we see the introduction of concepts like transfer of light, which is where you have two planets that are not aspecting each other or that are separating. But if you have a third planet like the moon or Mercury that's really fast and it swoops in and it separates from one planet and applies to another, then it can connect the two of them or transfer the light, as it's called, right?
Yeah. And if the ascendant is too early or too late as well, they introduced, didn't they?
Yeah.
So maybe they just wanted to come up with a whole lot of different kind of mitigating factors.
Yeah, and there's a lot of little factors like that then came about and either were, deliberately invented or that were discovered. I don't really know, but I think it was possibly connected with horary, which is much more dynamic.
The rise of horary,
Yeah, which is a much more dynamic use of horary, where this notion of like application and separation and what are the significators doing becomes very important. And especially the moon in horary is always treated as a secondary significator for the question or for the querent.
And is vital in electional astrology.
Yeah, exactly. So if the moon is not in good shape according to there's many different conditions where the moon can be in good shape or bad shape, then that's very important in either your Hori question or in your electional chart.
Yeah.
So let me read you some definitions of void of course that come from the medieval tradition from like the 8th and 9th century.
And who they're from.
Yeah, so this is from a book by my friend Benjamin Dykes, where he translated a bunch of medieval texts a few years ago. And this book is titled Introductions to Traditional Astrology, Abu Mashar and Al-Kabisi. Okay. So here is and I don't have like the PDF. I have like a pre-publication version just on my computer that I was proofreading. So this may not be the final translation, but it's close enough. So it says, emptiness of course. So this is from like book 3 or section 3, definition 9. The Arabic, Ben says, is emptiness of course, and other later translators translated it as solitude or void in course, and so on and so forth. So according to the abbreviation of the Introduction to Astrology by Abu Mashar, it says, solitude is if, a little after disregard, some star attaches to it in none of the above stated ways, but neither does it attach to any star while it is in that sign. So that's a little complicated because it's like taking into account other definitions such as disregard that it's already defined, but let's read the next one. This is from Abu Mashar's greater introduction. It says, the emptying of the course is if a planet would be separated from the conjunction of another planet by bodily conjunction or by aspect, and it would not be joined to another so long as it were in that same sign. Or a definition from Al-Kabisi. It says, and if one planet is being disregarded by another, and it is being connected to none of the planets so long as it is in the same sign, its course is said to be empty. And finally, from the Book of Nine Judgments, I think this is what this is, or Nine Judges, unless this is from Al-Kabisi, I'm actually not sure, but it says, if the moon were void in course, it signifies futility and annulment, and turning back from that same purpose, and the impediment of that same purpose. And Ben has a little definition, or a little diagram here, and he goes on to like explicate the concept. So what's interesting here is in the Abu Mashar definition, we're seeing the introduction of something that's new, which is he has this statement, so long as it were in the same sign. So he says, when a planet is separated from the conjunction of another planet, either bodily conjunction, which is what we consider to be a conjunction today, or by aspect, and what it means by that is by the other aspects, which are sextile, square, trine, or opposition, and it would not be joined to another planet so long as it were in the same sign.
Okay.
So here we're starting to see a different definition coming along.
And when was he writing?
Abu Mashar was in the 9th century, so let's say around the year 850 or something CE.
Okay.
So he doesn't specify
so
any...
he's the culprit by the sounds of it.
Because although...
Yeah, I was just going to say, because the other thing that I keep thinking as we're talking is, nowadays people don't just talk about the moon being void, of course. People will say, the sun goes, well, not the sun really, but, Venus goes void, of course, or, planets are said to, some people talk about planets being void, of course. I mean, I don't know how unorthodox that is, but they're definitely using this same definition as well, so... Then you sort of think, okay, well, when did that start? And, how's this all grown up? Because I feel like we should stick with the original, quite frankly.
Well, that's a really good point, though, is that you're making here, because one of the things we can note about this definition is that it doesn't restrict it to the moon in Abu Mashar's definition. It just says if a planet is separated from the conjunction of another planet, and then
the moon
isn't
even a planet.
Well, it's just that it means that it's not just restricted to the moon in this case, even though the original definition in the Hellenistic tradition seemed to be just about the moon. They've actually made it wider so that it's talking about any planet, and any planet, as long as it's not applying to another planet, will not complete that aspect before it changes sign. So maybe that's also, again, due to horary, because it has to do with the horary significators and what they're going to do and how that describes the outcome of the question.
I don't think horary takes into account a planet being void of course, though, does it? Well, I suppose it does in terms of the fact that if it's a significator, it's not applying to the, the object. I suppose it does it does and it doesn't. It does, but not specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's relevant. It's not the most common thing, but if the planet, which is one of your important significators, if it's towards the end of the sign and it's not applying to any other planet, then that may tell you something about, let's say if somebody's asking if their person they're interested in, if they're going to get married or something like that, and the significator of the other party is like
void of course,
then that's not going to be a great indication that you guys are getting together in the future, because the planets themselves are not moving towards each other, and one of them is just completely out to lunch and wandering around on its own. So perhaps that represents a sort of wandering or isolation on the part of that person.
But you were saying that the Hellenistic astrologers who were first talking about the moon being void of course in using the traditional or original definition, they were applying it to natal charts. And now we're talking about it being taken from natal charts into something which didn't even exist at the start of things, horary, which was introduced, I suppose. So again, I think we're mixing apples with oranges. I do, but it doesn't leave me any clearer in a way, but at least I'm understanding the timeline.
I mean, that being said, there may have used it in electional charts. There's a few surviving works on electional astrology, like Dorotheus of Sidon from the 1st century or Hephaestio of Thebes from the 5th century. I can't remember. I think Hephaestio might mention void of course as an electional condition at one point, but that being said, it's mainly used in a natal context, like we saw in Firmicus Maternus.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I do think it's important. The other thing that's a difference is that in the Hellenistic tradition, they were using both sign-based aspects and degree-based aspects. But in the medieval tradition, due to the shift towards horary, there was a shift more towards just using degree-based aspects rather than, in addition, using aspects by sign. So I think that's also a relevant consideration here, because the definition of void of course also becomes more dynamic and becomes more focused on just very close degree-based aspects at this point.
It becomes based on not making an aspect before leaving the sign.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So, at that point we could stop, because we think, okay, here it is, the definition of void of course. It's introduced in the medieval period. We see it here in Abu Mashar. And then that definition more or less gets repeated by later authors such as Guido Bonatti and William Lilly in the 17th century, who
really takes it to town, I suppose, because he could print his book.
Well, he was important. Lilly was important because he was the first major astrologer that wrote a major textbook on astrology in English. And up to that point, the astrologers tended to write their books in Latin, basically, because Latin was the educated language in Europe at the time that scientific and philosophical works were written in. So Lilly wanted his text to be more accessible, so he wrote it in English, and a lot of astrologers followed suit shortly after Lilly did that. But Lilly has a definition of void of course in his book Christian Astrology that then has pretty much influenced all subsequent traditions of understanding void of course in the rest of the English tradition at this point.
Yeah.
You don't happen to have a copy of Lilly lying around, do you?
I do not have a copy of Lilly in this house, actually. It's in storage.
You don't just have 17th century text lying around?
No, but I might have it on PDF. Hang on. It is on PDF.
Okay, well, I actually do have a copy of Lilly lying around right behind me, so I'm going to very quickly flip to his definition of void of course.
Okay.
I can't, unfortunately, put it up on the screen, but I can at least read it for us. If you find a PDF, that would be great. I know his definition
I found
void of course is somewhere in the first book.
Okay,
because he defines a bunch of terms and concepts.
Yeah, it's all public domain now for poor old Mr. Lilly.
Yeah, that copyright ran out a few centuries ago.
exactly. No, it's not. It's not going to be easy to search because it's kind of a picture. It's not text. It's
a scan of it. Okay.
Yeah, it's a scan.
He deals with the moon. This is funny that we're doing all this on the fly here with this episode, but that's fine.
We pretty much know what his definition is anyway. I mean, I suppose it's nice to hear it from the horse's mouth.
It's important because there's been a reinterpretation of Lily that's led to a brand new definition.
Okay.
And so we have to be aware of that because now it turns out that there's other astrologers who define it differently in the modern period, and that's starting to cause some different
you see, I'm anti all this sort of just let's all just decide how we want it to be. I think we have to go. The last question today, Chris, which we will get to, but is going to be, are we going to try and resurrect the original void of course moon definitions? And I think I can tell you right here and now my answer is yes. I'm all for it. But let's see what Lily says when he decides to weigh in however many hundreds of years later.
Yeah, I mean, I'll get to mine later, but part of my thing is I think when it comes to things like this, that all of these considerations are relevant and have something important to say from a symbolic standpoint. So that's one of the things that's useful, though, about understanding the distinction between them. So any luck? I found the consideration before judgment where he defines what it... Oh, here it is, void of course. Yeah. Okay, so it's on page... I'm reading the Acela edition of Lily, which is my favorite edition, which I'm sad is out of print because it seems like the best one, but it's on page 54 of the Acela edition, which is around page 112 of Lily's actual text. It says, void of course. A planet is void of course when he is separated from a planet, nor doth forthwith, remember this is the 17th century, nor doth forthwith during his being in that sign apply to any other. This is most usually in the moon. In judgments, do you carefully observe whether she be void of course, yea or no? You shall seldom see a business go handsomely forward when she is so. Okay,
so it's that's very much about horary, not about natal. Just for the record.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much because Lily, book one of Lily is like introductory concepts, and then right away in book two, he jumps right into horary astrology.
Yeah.
So horary was for Lily his primary practice.
It was his thing,
He does introduce natal astrology in book three, but it's not as thorough as a treatment as his treatment of horary is. And one of the reasons people really love Lily's work is that he uses a bunch of example charts of real-life horary questions to demonstrate how things worked out and what the interpretation of the chart was. So later on page like 122 of Lily, he has different considerations before judgment, which are different like horary considerations that you're supposed to take into account before judging a horary chart or before interpreting one. One of the ones that he says is he gives a few conditions of the moon. One of the ones he says it's not safe to judge when the moon is in the later degrees of a sign, especially in Gemini, Scorpio, or Capricorn. And then he goes on, he mentions the Via Combusta. Then he says, all matter of matters go hardly on, except the principal significators be very strong, except if they're very strong, when the moon is void of course. Yet somewhat she performs, if void of course, and be in either Taurus, Cancer, Sagittarius, or Pisces. So basically he reiterates the void of course thing. He says in interpretation that if you get a horary chart where the moon is void of course, a horary question, he says all manner of matters go hardly on. But then he gives an exception and he says unless the moon is in the sign of its exaltation, which is Taurus, sign of its domicile, which is Cancer, or in one of the signs ruled by Jupiter, which is Sagittarius or Pisces. So,
and is that's purely because Jupiter's lucky?
Yeah, Jupiter's the greater benefic planet.
Okay.
Presumably, I mean, I don't know if this is. I think this is
because when you said that, I was thinking, okay, but why Pisces and Sagittarius? I didn't think, of course, they're both ruled by Jupiter traditionally.
Well, and additionally, the other mitigation he said is he said matters go hardly on unless the principal significators be very strong.
Yeah.
So he's saying there's some instances where the moon can be void of course, but the horary question can still be positive if other factors in the chart are strong.
Like if the sun's sextiling Venus or something.
Yeah, like if the
so the significator and all that.
The significators are dignified, or alternatively, if the moon herself is dignified, that can nullify or counteract the void of course placement if the moon is in Taurus, Cancer, Sagittarius, or Pisces. So this is important because, since this is the first English version of void of course, this version gets repeated by astrologers for the next 2 or 3 centuries, and I think eventually becomes kind of the basis for Al Morrison's in a sense.
Definitely. He's definitely gone from that.
Yeah. So one of the things, though, that's unfortunate is typically those mitigating conditions aren't taken into account, where, for example, that being an exception in those 4 signs. And that became relevant because I remember some of the research I did is going back to 2004, the 2004 United States presidential election, when John Kerry was nominated for the Democrats. The moon was void of course, but if I'm remembering correctly, it was void of course in Sagittarius or something like that. So there was a mitigation, or there was one of these nominations not too long ago. Maybe that was the one for George Bush, actually, where it was like void of course, but there was a mitigation like that.
Right.
And I noticed that people weren't taking into account mitigations.
Yeah. Interesting.
Anyway, so we had to read Lily's definition because just from a basic reading of that, it seems as if that's just following the earlier medieval definition of void of course, which seems very similar to the modern definition, right?
Yeah, it does. It seems almost exactly the same, apart from that nobody takes into account the mitigations.
Okay, so the problem...
And I don't think they're mentioned by Al Morrison either, frankly, but I don't know. I only know what I know about him from Debbie Kempton-Smith. Right.
So the problem is that... there's another definition that's come about that I tried to document as interpretation or version 3 of the concept of void of course in my article, which is that there's been some alternative interpretation of Lily's definition of void of course and what he meant by that in the 1980s and 1990s. In particular, there was this 1995 article titled "The Considerations Before Judgment" by the astrologer Sue Ward, where she argued that Lily's definition of void of course had been misunderstood and provided an alternative interpretation that was quite different than what the modern astrologers had been using or how people had understood that definition up to that point. So basically...
Yeah, I actually have this definition in my book Moonology. Strangely, I think that I've got it. I must have got it from you, but the moon is not making an exact aspect within 10-degree orb. But a lot of people don't know about that because I've run that past other astrologers and they've gone, huh? Never heard that one.
Yeah, so let me read just because I'm trying to remember exactly how it went, but my summary of this and of Sue's argument was that even though Lily is usually used as the primary source of the modern definition of void of course, where a planet is void when it will complete no other aspects until it moves into the next sign, Sue Ward argued that Lily's actual working definition in chart examples was that a planet is only void of course when it is not applying to an aspect with another planet within orb, regardless of sign boundaries. So I go on and I say this interpretation of Lily's definition of void of course is similar to the original Hellenistic definition in that it ignores sign boundaries, although it happens much more frequently than the Hellenistic definition because Lily's orb for applying aspects tends to be less than 10 degrees. Unfortunately, since this interpretation of Lily's definition of void of course is largely based on references made or inferences made from his chart examples, it's somewhat controversial. Some astrologers agree that this is the correct interpretation of what Lily meant, and thus that there's a third definition of void of course, while others do not agree that this is the correct interpretation of the text, and thus they believe that there are only 2 potential definitions, which is the Hellenistic and the modern one. So maybe we should give an example. Let me see if I have a diagram that shows, here's one. So that I made that shows this definition, if this interpretation of Lily is correct, where let's imagine that the moon is you have a chart where the moon is at 10 degrees of Aries, and it's just completed a sextile with Venus at 10 degrees of Aquarius. And the next aspect that the moon is going to make is not until it reaches a conjunction with Jupiter at 29 degrees of Aries at the very end of that sign. So this is something like 18 or 19 degrees away before the moon will conjoin Jupiter, which is outside of any sort of standard orb for a conjunction or other major aspect, which usually tends to be like 10 degrees or less. So the point is that the moon would be void of course then during the range in which it is outside of the orb of an exact aspect with another planet using the Ptolemaic aspects. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense. So it's void, and then it's not void before it actually leaves Aries.
Yeah, so this definition would completely remove any consideration of sign boundary because it all just entirely becomes a matter of is the moon within orb of an aspect, an applying aspect, not separating aspect, I don't think is taken into account, or is it not?
And do we think that Lily came up with this after years and years of doing horary and researching and then came up with this idea, or plucked it out of thin air because it made the king happy, or what do we think happened here?
So I don't know, because I don't know if this is a correct interpretation of Lily, and I'm not enough of like a Lily scholar to wade into trying to either defend this interpretation or to reject it entirely. I am somewhat suspicious that the medieval astrologers like Abu Mashar, like we saw, are clearly mentioning a sign boundary being involved in the definition of void of course. I believe when I brought this up to Ben Dykes, he also pointed out that Guido Bonatti is also taking into account a sign boundary as part of their basic definition of void of course, and that Lilly, I believe himself, also mentioned a sign boundary in his definition of void of course, so that I'm a little bit skeptical that the sign boundary thing is just completely not taken into account at all.
Yeah.
But I don't want to come down too hard either way. I just wanted to outline that what this means effectively is that we've got three different possible definitions of void of course.
Yeah.
We have the modern definition that we started with at the beginning of this discussion, which is the one most modern astrologers use at this point over the past few decades.
Which I think we can safely call the Lilly definition for people, because that does, he did popularize it, unless Sue Ward is right, but it's hard because what was he? Maybe he was a sloppy astrologer. Maybe he did research and he went from what they'd been saying all these years about the sign definition, and the guy was probably doing, how many horary charts a day was he doing? He was probably researching as he went, going, well, hang on a minute, the moon, I see the moon as, maybe he was one of the biggest researchers of all and we should listen to him. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, it is tricky when it comes to astrologers sometimes in the theory of how they outline something versus what they do actually in chart examples. Maybe there could be differences between those sometimes. And I think maybe, that's possible, so that we have to take that into account as a possibility, especially if Sue Ward is saying that this is due to seeing inconsistencies in the way that he's applying this in the actual chart examples. And people can read this article. It's still on Sue Ward's website, or it's on somebody's website, which is horary.com, and it's titled The Considerations Before Judgment by Sue Ward. And if you scroll down to the section about 3/4 of the way through, it has a whole section titled Void of Course. And she says, contrary to what most of us understood, this does not mean that the aspect has to perfect when the moon is in its current sign. What it does mean is that the application has to be in effect while the moon is in its current sign. Application operates only when the moon or planet is, quote, within orbs of the planet and next meets by major aspect. Blah, blah, blah. This matter largely depends on the definition of application in Lilly's terms and those of the authors he drew upon and what it meant to be within orb. And then she cites some other examples. The evidence in Christian astrology supports this almost exclusively, and I conclude that the moon is not void of course if it is in contacting another planet through the joint moieties. And moieties is like a obscure medieval orb system. Whether it perfects in and out of
its current sign. So just so I understand, so Sue Ward is saying that in these charts of Lily's that she studied, the moon is not void of course if contacting another planet through joint moieties, whether or not, say if it's at, 29 degrees of Sagittarius and Venus is at 0 degrees of Gemini, but there's no other planets for it to aspect before it changes signs, then it's not void of course because it's going to aspect Venus in a minute.
Yeah, I mean, I think she's basically saying that if the moon, let's say, is at 29 degrees of the sign, but Venus is at 1 degree of the next sign, that it's not void of course because it's within an orb of a conjunction. Okay. So that's her definition.
Right. Where does this leave us?
Yeah, well, it leaves us with a big mess. But here's the example she cites. She says, the crucial point about this definition of application, and having checked all the charts in Christian astrology to see just how Lily uses this term, I found only 3 that are dubious in this regard. Well, she's listing counterexamples, so we don't have to go into that. But the point is just that...
Can we just say good work by Sue Ward?
Maybe if she's right. I don't know if she's right or wrong. There's some astrologers I know that are really into Renaissance astrology that believe very strongly that Sue Ward is right, and this is the working definition of void of course that they use, and they think that this was the original definition. But then there's also some Renaissance astrologers, people that practice Renaissance horary and other astrology, that strongly believe that Sue Ward's interpretation of this is wrong.
Okay.
So we're not going to come down on either side of that, but we will say that due to this, at the very least, even if this was a wrong interpretation, it's now created a third variant or a third version of what it means for a planet to be void of course in modern times. Because regardless of if this is correctly what Lily thought, there are now astrologers that are using this definition in modern times in their personal practice based on the belief that this is what Lily did.
This would be a small percentage, though, wouldn't it?
I don't know what the percentage is because there's a decent number of, I don't want to name names because I'm not 100% positive on who falls where on this, but there are some rather prominent Renaissance-style astrologers and horary practitioners that I think do use this definition following Sue Ward.
The Wardian definition, we should call it.
Yeah, the Wardian. I like that. There's a ring to it. Assuming that I'm right, that she was the one that came up with this, which I'm pretty sure I am, but just to cover my bases. So anyways, back to our overview, though, this means that there's 3 different definitions then of void of course, potentially. There is 1, when the moon does not complete an exact Ptolemaic aspect with any planet within the next 30 degrees, which is the Hellenistic definition. 2, the moon does not complete an exact Ptolemaic aspect with another planet until it moves into the following sign of the zodiac, which is let's say the modern definition. And then 3, the moon is not applying to an exact Ptolemaic aspect within orb, whatever the orb is of the planet or the moon in this instance, regardless of sign boundary.
Yeah. And so if you think about it, they've had about equal, well, let's not take the Wardian definition in just for the moment, but the other 2 have had about 50-50 of astrology's history as we've defined it today. Since it was first mentioned to now, it's been about 2,000 years, hasn't it? And it's been about 900 years each, maybe a little bit more on the, you call it modern, I call it medieval, Al Morrison version.
Yeah, I mean, you could definitely say that. You could split the tradition in half. If you, let's put the Sue Ward definition aside, then we could say if there were only those first 2 definitions, then probably almost the first 1,000 years of the practice of Western astrology from maybe the 1st century BCE until the 7th century CE used the Hellenistic definition, the 30-degree one. And then from about the 8th century forward, astrologers have used the other definition where it doesn't make another aspect until it changes signs.
Yeah. And just to jog my memory, so because I actually had assumed that the changeover came with Lily in the sort of 1600s, but you've explained to me today, in fact, it was first mentioned around 800. So
Yeah. I
was
mean,
it mentioned in 800 only with regards to horary, or was it? No, well, yes, it was. It came up in in sort of 800 because of horary, not natal.
I mean, it
because
was
that also
introduced.
is a slightly cloudy thing in the whole thing as well.
I mean, it's introduced in the 8th century within the context of just general definitions in introductory works on astrology of like
Not
concepts that you need to know. Yeah,
Okay.
because it's in Abu Mashar's Greater Introduction, and he's trying to introduce concepts you need to know for everything.
Okay.
And Al-Kabisi is basically just writing a shortened version of Abu Mashar. So it was stuff that was supposed to apply to natal and electional and horary. Although certainly the new popularity, like horary was kind of like a new technology, sort of like the iPhone or something like that was introduced 10 years ago, and everybody was using it and it became really popular. Horary was a little bit like that, I think, where once it was introduced and it got really integrated into the tradition, like people started using it a lot more. And some of these concepts may have become more popular partially as a result of that.
Okay, I have a thesis after this incredibly illuminating and fascinating discussion with you, Chris, which I'm really grateful for. This is my deduction from this, and you tell me what you think. It's not my final thing. I just want to get your opinion. Okay, I think
be careful, because this might become the Boland definition, like for the next several centuries.
Exactly.
So whatever you say.
Okay, all right. When you're looking at a natal chart, go Hellenistic. If you're doing horary, you can use the other one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that might be okay. I mean, because one of the things about the Hellenistic definition is you're hardly ever going to see it, so it's almost not relevant in most discussions. And
I think that's good for people not to feel that they're born under a void of course moon. I don't think we need to put that on people if it wasn't invented until the 8th century.
Yeah, well, and even if you do have a Hellenistic version of a void of course moon, there can still be like mitigating conditions and other exceptions that are going to make it not that bad. That being said, one of the things that appeals to people sometimes about traditional astrology is sometimes, even though some of those definitions, like what I was reading from Firmicus, can sound extreme, sometimes people do have genuine hardships or trauma or difficulty in their life in certain areas. And sometimes it's useful or helpful or good when the astrology is able to articulate, why, or articulate what part of a person's life maybe that they have had some problems in, if they have had that, and there can be something useful and therapeutic about it that doesn't necessarily have to be all, depressing and oppressive. But
Saturn is often going to be the culprit anyway. So, when you talk about misery, I mean, Saturn and misery do go hand in hand. So look at that as well. I just think the idea of the void of course moon, it's almost like saying, your life is, it's not right. I don't think, and I'm glad that your astrological exposition here has supported the idea that it actually makes sense to use the Hellenistic version, at least in natal charts. And, obviously people are going to have tough times. And some people, I know the son of a billionaire who's got Venus square Saturn who doesn't get on with his mum. So, astrology will always play out. But I don't think that, I think if astrology, if this wasn't in the original remit, I'm happy not to tell people who were born, I'm happy not to tell people they were born with a void of course moon. It's somehow I don't like the idea of being born with that. It's like, nothing's going to come of your life. What a horrible thing to have to say to someone.
Yeah, there can be difficult indications in a birth chart. I don't think I don't think this is super important using the Hellenistic definition. I think it's something, because it was recently rediscovered, like astrologers, it's only in the past 10 years or 20 years tops that these texts that contain the Hellenistic definition have been translated. So astrologers haven't even had very long to start observing this condition again in astrology in general. And so
Yeah.
that's one of the things that I think we have to do is that,
That's just amazing.
when that comes up once a year now, I guess the next one is in October, the last one was in August, we should pay attention to what
Yeah.
happens on that day or what happens in electional charts and
Yeah.
see what happens and see if that sheds
Yes.
any light on the usefulness of this as a unique and somewhat rare concept, in the same way that, comets, there's indications for comets sometimes in some of the ancient texts, which also don't happen very often, but occasionally when they do, for example, I think there was like a comet last spring around the time of the coronavirus outbreak and the
Yeah,
lockdowns.
that's true, actually. I saw it. Did you
Yeah,
see it in
sometimes.
America?
I didn't. I was staying inside like way too much during that time period, partially because I was
Mm.
sick. But
Mm.
yeah, sometimes there can be very rare astronomical phenomena that when it occurs, like important things do happen or coincide with it.
Yeah.
And
In
paying attention to
fairness,
those.
for the sake of historical accuracy,
Mhm.
I saw that comet. I was in France, and the coronavirus was already in full swing. Just so we don't
Yeah.
say it was a portent. It was June, and we'd all been in lockdown since February, so we can't fairly say that it was a portent of the coronavirus, because it was in full swing.
Yeah, I
Just
don't
for
think
the
it was a
sake of
portent.
historical accuracy and
I
not
think it was
freaking people out.
I think it was interesting that it was discovered around April or something like that, is when
Right.
astronomers first became aware that it would be coming into view. And I do think it's interesting that it coincided with some of the waves of like deaths around the world, or some of the first major waves of deaths in some parts of the world. But that's a whole thing. Mundane astrology is a whole weird thing unto itself. And there was a lot
Yeah.
more going on astrologically last year than just that, with the pileup of planets in Capricorn and
It
everything
was
else.
amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in
And
terms of
amazing
void of
this year
course,
as well.
yeah,
Yeah,
we
no,
just
that's
had the
very
huge.
interesting. But can I just say one more thing? Because you were saying, like, okay, so now let's look in October when the moon actually goes, void of course with the original example. And,
Right.
as far as I'm aware, well, I know this because I looked at it, one of your arguments for using whole sign houses is it's the oldest, it's the first one. And, why would we just take on these other house systems that people have since decided to use? And I think we should think like that. I do. And, if people are going to take the trouble to translate these ancient documents and tell us what they mean, then I think it's important that we take them on board. And I think for that reason, I think we should bring it back.
Well,
I'm all for it, except maybe an electional.
Let me clarify though, with whole sign houses,
Yeah.
part of my argument is actually just that in the Hellenistic tradition, they used both whole sign houses and different degree-based forms of house division, like equal houses or quadrant houses, which is similar to like modern day, let's say, Placidus houses. They would use both at once, but they would start with the sign-based approach and then overlay the degree-based approach on top of that. So part of my argument is just that we've shifted over the past 1,000 years entirely to the degree-based approach to astrology, partially, I think, due to horary. And it would be good for us to start taking into account the sign-based approach again, which includes not just whole sign houses, but also whole sign aspects as well.
Yeah, no, I'm all for it. And, like I said, I don't know if I said it on camera or off camera, but I saw your argument for whole sign houses. I read your document and I was like, well, I'm convinced. And then I saw Robert Hand was saying exactly, had actually said the same thing to me at a conference 10 years earlier, when I hadn't swapped. I think I was using Placidus, but I just swapped from then on. I just went, no, that's it. I'm whole sign all the way now. I think, and I think if it was there in the beginning, and then the monks invented Placidus at some point. It's like, I don't know. I'd like to go to the root of it, which is why I wanted to have this conversation about the void of course moon. Like, if people are going to decipher these documents, let's listen to what they've got to say.
Sure. And one of the things I would say, because there's a part of that I definitely agree with, but I also want to, at the end of my book, like I wrote an entire 700-page book called Hellenistic Astrology, the Study of Fate and Fortune in 2017, which took me 10 years to write and was one of the first comprehensive treatments of ancient Hellenistic astrology as it was practiced from the 1st century BCE until the 7th century CE, one of the first comprehensive treatments in modern times. But I very deliberately, at the end of that book, in my conclusion, my final paragraph, really made it a really strong point to say that while I do think that there's a good reason to go back and look at the past and to take some of the best pieces of astrology from the past and bring them forward into the future, I don't think the purpose is to go back into the past and to stay there. And I don't necessarily want to be the result. I don't want this to result in some sort of astrological fundamentalism where people only go back and use ancient astrology and they ignore some of the great innovations that occurred in the later medieval and Renaissance and modern astrological traditions. So I think that actually the best approach is to synthesize some of the best parts from ancient astrology with some of the best parts from modern astrology, and that there's something to be gained from all of those different approaches.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do agree with that, but I also think that you can't just go changing the rules. Like, there's a difference between, you can add the overlay of modern psychological astrology to traditional astrology, and you can add in, Neptune and Uranus and Pluto and all that. But that's not fundamentally changing the rules. That's sort of...
You don't think so?
I mean, that's what I do a lot of in my own work. I work with angels and goddesses and all sorts. Using
right.
the astrology. I'm a little
surprised you're the one arguing for the fundamentalism here, and I'm the one arguing for the, embracing of modern
nothing
and
will
ancient.
convince me from now on. For me, the void of course moon in a natal chart is the Hellenistic version, and no one's going to talk me out of that. Okay. If you want to say in horary, and the one I don't know what I think yet is electional, because I think electional really, did it come from horary? So we kind of have to put it in the horary basket. I mean, it sort of did in a way, didn't it? It's like
okay, that's a good discussion
horary
point. Let's focus on that point. So I agree. I don't think void of course is that relevant in natal, and it's not going to be super huge of an important consideration. So we'll set that aside and just say not that important for natal. And if you're using the Hellenistic definition, then it's not going to show up in like 99.9% of the charts that you look at anyways.
Yeah.
Void of course is primarily relevant in electional astrology and in horary astrology. So not a lot of astrologers proportionally practice natal astrology, but there are enough that use some form of electional astrology where this is a genuine question then of what should you use? Yeah. And that's actually a really interesting thing. So what were you saying about that in the context of electional?
Well, what I was saying was that, okay, I can see that horary astrology has almost, got its own definition of the void of course moon, that it's taken to its heart and it's really embedded in there. And I suppose you could see horary astrology and electional astrology as kind of a mirror, because if you cast a chart for a horary question or you cast a chart for opening your new business, it's sort of a similar thing. So I suppose from that definition, I mean, again, I don't know, is there a clear demarcation between which came first, or electional or horary, or did they kind of come at the same time because they are kind of the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, electional started first, and we have the first full-fledged texts on electional astrology that exist from the 1st century BCE and especially the 1st century CE, whereas
then it's sort of giving it the Hellenistic thing then, isn't it? But then do I have the courage to start a new business when the moon is void of course? I don't know. When it's medieval void of course, I think I would still rather that the moon had changed signs. So now I've got to deprogram myself.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to answer your question, though, that horary developed out of electional and electional came first, but they're still very much intertwined in terms of their history and their techniques, and there's a lot of overlap there. To me, the way that I've been approaching this question, just to answer what some people may be asking in terms of how I deal with this, is I think that they're all relevant in some way, but just in differing levels of intensity and relevance. Like maybe the worst case scenario is the Hellenistic definition of void of course, where it's not applying to anything within the next 2 days, basically, which is a very extreme and rare condition, which might be potentially very extreme and not good if you were trying to launch a major venture at that time. Like let's say there's a business that you wanted to launch and you were about to try to found like a new website company that was going to compete with like Google or something like that. Yeah. And you're desperately hoping for the success of this venture in the future. You're going to probably want to follow standard electional rules and try to pick a day where the moon is applying to a favorable aspect with, like, let's say Jupiter in a day chart, like a conjunction with Jupiter, because in intellectual astrology, applying aspects indicate the future and separating aspects indicate the past. So whatever the moon is applying to is going to indicate the future of what you initiate at that time.
Yeah. And you're more or less making a birth chart for your business.
Yeah, exactly. That's the real promise, and that's the thing that's interesting with electional astrology is really the concept that you can deliberately choose the birth chart for whatever you're starting at that time, whether it's a business or a marriage or like a major journey or writing a book. Have you used electional for any of your major books or projects?
Yeah.
For everything?
I mean, if I'm writing a pitch for my next book, I will not send it when the moon is, medieval/modern void of course.
Okay.
I'll always look at the chart before I send it. And one thing I get a lot, though, is I get the moon in the 12th house a lot when I'm thinking, shall I do this now? Because there's a part of me that thinks if I change my action just because the moon is void of course, does that even count? Because the idea was kind of there. But then I often get the moon in the 12th house, and somehow that seems to apply. That seems to be okay for me when it's an astrological matter, because I think, it's hidden and it's secret and it's all moon, and it's all because I do moonology. So
okay.
Anyway, I think okay. I think I'd go Hellenistic natal, and I think I would look at medieval for electional and horary. I think because they're so similar, they need to be in the same basket.
And the way I do it sort of a hierarchy where I say worst case scenario is the Hellenistic definition. Let's say an electional chart would be the Hellenistic one. I would probably want to avoid that the most if I had a choice.
Yeah, for sure.
Then the next worst one is going to be that the moon is, in terms of what I actually pay attention to, actually is the moon applying to within reasonable orb of, like, let's say 13 degrees or 12 degrees, which is the average daily motion of the moon, that it'll move in a 24-hour period. Is the moon applying within 12 degrees to an exact aspect, even if there's no sign boundary? And is it a favorable aspect? So even if the moon is applying to something like a benefic, if it's not going to complete that while it's still in that sign, but it will hit a benefic as soon as it changes signs within, like, let's say a few degrees, then I'll still treat that as a favorable indication that's probably okay to go with if it's like
within 12 or 13 degrees because of the daily motion.
Yeah, with like 12 degrees, which is actually the ancient Hellenistic orb of the moon was 12 degrees. They used 3 degrees for degree-based aspects for planets, like especially 3 degrees, but they would extend it to 12 degrees for the moon because the moon moves about 12 degrees in a 24-hour period.
Yeah.
So 12 degrees, regardless of sign boundaries, the next one down. And then finally, the next and sort of least important would be the other definition, which is just, is it not going to complete an aspect before it changes sign boundaries, only because that happens so frequently.
Yeah.
That's sort of how I structure it myself, just in terms of all of them probably, because what we're doing here when we're talking about astrology is we're talking about symbolism. We're taking, astronomical movements and astronomical placements, and then we're saying, what would that describe if it was describing something, or if we were to interpret it symbolically?
Yeah.
And I don't think the answer is that one of these has a symbolic interpretation that's relevant and the other two don't have any symbolic interpretation, but rather all 3 of them in some way could probably describe some scenario that's relevant or could manifest in some specific way. It's just a matter of, like, what priority are you really going to give that if you're using that in electional astrology? And for me, even if I use that hierarchy of those 3, that's still kind of low down on my considerations for electional astrology. And I'm usually
is it? Because it's my number one.
It's your number one is just start with the moon and what is the moon doing?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I thought that was sort of what everybody did.
I mean, I think it is to a certain extent, only in so much as the concept of void of course has been so popularized and almost over-popularized that that's the first thing that most people in modern astrology learn about electional astrology is the void of course thing, Because one of the things I learned when I started trying to learn electional astrology in the mid-2000s is that there weren't a lot of texts out there written in modern times on electional astrology. Like there's just not a lot of books on electional. I think there was one written finally in the past 20 years, like that little short book on electional by somebody, but it's not a very common topic. So I don't think most modern astrologers are that familiar with like what some of the traditional rules were for electional astrology and like Hellenistic or medieval astrology necessarily.
Well, there's a niche because, that's basically what astrologers do a lot of, is people in my work, people are always asking me, when should I get married? When should I move house? When should I do this? When should I do that? I mean, somebody should write that book and it's not going to be
me. I will put it out there that could be something that could be filled in the not too distant future, since that is something I specialize in, and that's something my partner and I specialize in, where we do a podcast each month where we release 4 auspicious electional charts for the month ahead, and we just tell you like what the good charts are for each month. Right now we're actually working on the charts for March of 2021, so we're getting ready to record that in the next few days. It's something that's available through our page on patreon.com, but I might fill that need at some point in the not too distant future with a work on electional astrology, because something that I would avoid more, for example, than a void of course moon is like the moon applying to an opposition with Saturn in a night chart, for example. Like that would be worse to me, because that's more of a definite no about what's coming up for you in the future, or a definite difficulty to me than a void of course moon using the modern definition. But for you, it's more, you'd be more wary of the void of course between those two?
Like between those two. I mean, the thing is, my dad was a psychiatrist and he always said to me, Yasmin, you're so black and white. So I have to believe that he was a good judge of my character. And I think I am very black and white. And I think for me, because I took it to heart, it's always been, no, void of course, don't.
Okay.
Like if I've got a big meeting, I'll look and that's the first thing I'll check. Because even if the sun's squaring Saturn or Pluto or whatever, I feel like, okay, well, you can push through things like that. But the void of course moon to me, and I feel like, God, how many years have I been doing this? But it's always been a non-starter. And now I'm really wondering about that. But I think I still will probably listen to it for, plans, but I'm definitely not going to take it into account. I'm going to go natal for Hellenistic for natal.
Okay. Can I throw one last little historical kink in this whole situation with a fourth definition that may exist of void of course?
Okay.
I'll try to keep it short, but so there were interactions between the Greek astrologers, or the astrologers who wrote in Greek during the time of the Roman Empire, from the 1st century through the 7th century CE. There were trading ships that would go back and forth between the Roman Empire and India. And as a result of that, there was interaction between the astrologers during that time period. And there were some works on Greek astrology that were translated into Sanskrit during that time.
Amazing.
As a result of that, so remember how the Greek astrologers, their original word for void of course moon was Kenodromia, which means running in the emptiness or running in the void. Well, in the Indian tradition, they have this definition that's used that's suspiciously called Kenodroma yoga, which is basically it's like a transliteration of the Greek term Kenodromia, where they've just taken the word and how it sounds by pronouncing it out loud, and they've rewritten it in the Sanskrit language, or the Sanskrit alphabet, basically. Okay, so listen to this. So this is just a Wikipedia page. It's not great, but it provides an acceptable definition. It says, Kenodroma yoga is one of the most important yogas formed by the moon. According to Varahamihira, who I think lived in like the 6th or 7th century, this yoga is formed when one house in front of and behind from the moon are vacant. In other words, the 2nd and 12th house from the moon should be vacant so that this yoga can be formed. This yoga is not at all inauspicious. Well, this is dumb. This is just Wikipedia editors, but it is considered to be inauspicious.
It provides strong power to a person. Interesting.
Well, I think, yeah, we have to be careful with Wikipedia, but at least the definition is correct, which is that the Indian definition of void of course is that the moon is in a sign on its own, and there's no planets either in the sign before the moon or the sign after the moon. And I think it also extends potentially to like aspects to those signs, although it gets complicated in terms of the Indian astrologers use a different aspect system than we do in the West. But it's very similar in its concept, which is just the moon is in a sign by itself, and it's neither separating by a sign-based aspect from any planets in the sign before it, nor is it applying to in the sign after the one that it's in to any planets in that sign either. So interestingly, there's mitigations for this, and the mitigation is, well, actually they don't list the mitigation very well in this, but there's some mitigations that were similar to the one in Firmicus about, I think it's like if benefics are angular or something like that, then it cancels out the negative indications of that placement.
Right.
So I just wanted to mention that as a potential like fourth one, if you want to throw that out there as well, that in the Indian tradition, due to the interaction between the Greek and Sanskrit astrologers, that they also have their own definition of void of course moon.
I mean, here my feeling is I don't think that you can just pluck what you like from Vedic astrology. Not you personally. One can't pluck what one likes from Vedic astrology and just chuck it into Western astrology. And I mean, I haven't thought about it that much, but I've thought about it a bit. You know, I was lucky enough to go to one of those East-West conferences in India that Alex Trenoweth organises. And, you know, so we had a lot of discussions there. And I mean, I know enough about Vedic astrology to know that you kind of, as much as I would like to mix them, because I'm a meditator, I'm a chanter, I work with the Hindu goddesses and all that, but you can't, I don't think you can take from Vedic astrology and put it in Western astrology. I think that's just too much. It's just because there's so much in Vedic that we don't understand that, you know, at least with Lily, you know, people have done the work for us in the past, or people like, you know, you and Sue Ward and whoever are doing the work now, but no.
Yeah.
Not going to get that. I'm not going to buy that one.
Really quickly, because I was just remembering where that came from, and it was from the Yasmin. I know this is going on really long, but I just want to make sure I include this.
I'm actually just curious to look that up. What was it called?
It's called Kenodromia yoga, and yoga just means like a combination or... So this is from chapter 10 of the Yasmin, and the Yasmin was one of the earliest texts where some scholars like David Pingree argue that this is a text on Greek astrology that was written in Egypt sometime around the 1st or 2nd century in Greek, and that he thought that it was translated at some point into Sanskrit and then synthesized or merged with the indigenous astrology of India at that point to create a sort of hybrid approach, which then became what we know of as Indian astrology over the past 2,000 years. So in chapter 10 of this text, it has this definition of void of course. It says, if a planet is in the second place from the moon, those who understand yogas call it sunafa. If it is leaving the moon, they call it anaphora. And if there are planets on both sides of the moon, they call it darudua, which is just like a transliteration of the Greek term dorophoria, which means bodyguarding or spear-bearing. He says, if these yogas with respect to the moon do not occur, and there are no planets in the cardines, which are the angular houses, the 1st, 4th, 10th, and 7th, this configuration, lacking the aspect of all the planets, is called Kenodromia, and it is of the lowest influence.
Right. But I mean, so there's quite a lot of mitigating things there. I mean, and also, I don't know, actually, are Vedic houses the same as, you know, Western houses?
A little bit. There's some overlap, yeah. So, but really quickly, it gives an interpretation later. It says, the authorities say that one born under Kenodromia is a low slave to others who does not enjoy family, wife, home, food, one whose actions and conduct are reviled and who practices various devices. Anyway, but the point was that it seems to be defining this in this text.
So So you have to have the moon in a house with an empty house before it, an empty house after it, and no planets in any of the angular houses.
Yeah, that seems to be the definition that it's giving here, which is oddly sort of similar a little bit to Firmicus's statement of having no benefics in the angular houses, which he used as a canceling thing. So that could give us some indication that this really was influenced by or had some connection with the Greek tradition. But it's interesting that in this context, at least, they're defining it as like sign-based aspects and a sort of bodily connection where the moon is not applying to any aspects by a sign-based aspect in the next sign following it.
Yeah, yeah. And with Firmicus, was it Firmicus you were referring to a second ago?
Yeah.
Yeah. Was he saying no planets in the angular houses or no planets on the actual angles?
Well, that's a tricky question in terms of Firmicus, because Firmicus is drawing on early sources, and Firmicus mixes whole sign houses with equal houses. Right. So he could have had something in mind that's like an overlap between the two, because in his delineations, he'll go through and delineate using whole sign houses, and he'll say a planet in an angular whole sign house is strong, but then he'll say, however, a planet that's on the exact degree of an angle like the midheaven will be the strongest. So there's like degrees of variation.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that I don't think we have to bring the fourth one into account. I think we can make our considerations before judgment based on the first three.
Okay.
Because I think that was a Sanskrit astrologer and a Western astrologer having a chat and there's something being lost in translation.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the things that fascinates me about the history of Western astrology is that is the astrological tradition, which is like every time you put two astrologers in a room together, they will start talking and comparing notes, and their astrologies will rub off on each other. Yeah. And sometimes they may not agree, and sometimes they may get into arguments, but nonetheless, even if there's like a tension between their approaches, there's still like some sort of exchange or rubbing off that occurs between the traditions. Yeah. And that's basically how we got to the type of astrology that we have today is 4,000 years of astrologers, trading techniques back and forth and developing new ideas and innovations, but also passing on as best as they could certain traditional doctrines. But like a game, I don't know if you have this, but in like elementary school, they had this game called Telephone where like 10 kids would sit in a circle and one...
Chinese whispers, I think we called it very politically incorrectly. Back in the day in Tasmania, Australia.
In Tasmania,
we whisper. One kid whispers to the next, to the next, to the next, and you see what comes out.
Yeah, and then what's funny is by the end of the circle, the message will often be much different than what it started as.
Which is why I like to go to the source.
Yeah, so that's what's useful about going back and studying the astrological tradition and studying the ancient sources is sometimes it gives you a clearer picture of how things started. And you don't always have to go back and stick with whatever that original message was. But at least if you go back and study the entire tradition, you can move forward more deliberately and more, consciously in terms of picking what definition you think makes the most sense and then going from there.
Whereas I would be more black and white about it and say, go to the source. If somebody can figure that out, go to the source. Because that is, and I suppose on one level, I do believe astrology in a way to be some kind of divine revelation, So as much as I think you can kind of add to it, like I said before, I'm not a big fan of changing the rules.
Okay.
But what a great conversation, Chris Brennan. Thank you so much. I've had so much fun. I'm not cutting you off, but just literally like, wow, that was great.
Yeah, thank you for doing this. I know this is you've been wanting to do like a short interview with me for a little while. You said we were going to do like 30 minutes. And then I said, I realized this could actually be an interesting topic, talking about the void of course moon. And it's something I'd been intending to do a longer podcast on for a while. Yeah. And then we just sort of did it suddenly at the spur of the moment. I think this went pretty well. And
so much food for thought.
The moon was void of course. So
hysterically.
Yeah, so as long as our recording doesn't like disappear immediately after this, I think.
Well, I have recorded me talking, I think. I haven't got you on my recording. I've just got me.
Well, as long as we've got your end of the conversation, I think we'll be good.
Fill in the gaps.
Right. People infer what the rest was.
Yeah, I can say whatever.
Where can people find out more information about you and what you have going on?
Well, people can find me at my website, yasminboland.com. They can find me on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube and Amazon and all that. And, I love astrology. I'm a passionate astrologer. And, but give full respect to people like you who've gone back and done the really hard yards so people like me can come along and just pick your brains and, just get the easy way.
Awesome. Well,
that sounds bad, but you know what I mean. I'm really grateful to people like you who've helped made it easy for people like me to kind of understand the context of the whole thing. Because I learned astrology and on a computer, and it just works. And you just test it and you go, oh, it works. Okay, fine, I've got it. But when you start to really look into it, that's when it blows your mind. So.
Yeah, one of the beautiful things about astrology and being an astrologer is there's many different ways to be an astrologer, and there's many different roles and ways that you can build a career doing astrology, and you don't have to just be locked into one thing, and there's many different people that specialize in different areas. So for me, one of the things I decided to specialize in is the history of astrology, and that's what I went to school for, but that's not everything, and that's not for everyone. So I'm always happy when I can use some of that knowledge and pass it on to other people based on what I've studied and everything else. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to do that today.
Oh, no, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. And, I would love to be able to, like you, have just the whole timeline of astrology in your head like that, with just everything completely I'm still shocked by looking on your website, just to finish off this, that when you give your timeline, I think I said this to you at the start, but Hermes Trismegistus doesn't come in until your third kind of period. You start in 5th century BCE, then the 4th century, then the 3rd century, 2nd century, and then in the 1st century BCE, we get a mention of Hermes Trismegistus. I'm amazed that there's 400 years of astrological history. I thought Hermes Trismegistus was about, I kind of thought Hermes Trismegistus was older than he is, frankly.
Yeah, there's a lot of early legendary stuff around astrology, and sometimes part of the challenge is unraveling the legends and the mythology that's built up from what actually happened and what the actual surviving evidence is. But most of Western astrology and Hellenistic astrology starts around the 1st century BCE, but there were 2,000-year-long traditions in Mesopotamia and Egypt of mundane astrology that built up to that point. So there's a lot of history.
And we're talking about stargazing, not entrail deducing.
Astrology started as a late form of divination where they started noting correlations between celestial movements and earthly events like eclipses.
And we're talking 5th century BCE.
More like 2000 BCE is when the first records of astrological omens are being recorded.
Actually, funny you should mention that, because I actually know that, because for one of my books, I wrote Angel Astrology 101 with a woman called Doreen Virtue, who's since abandoned everything to do with the New Age and become a fundamentalist Christian. So it was very interesting because, and she was kind of making the change just as we were writing the book. So she, I think, was a little bit conflicted about writing it at all with me. And so she got me to do a whole lot of research into Jesus, for one thing, which was, the fact that Jesus almost certainly would have known astrology because he was a Chaldean priest. And back in those days, everybody who was a Chaldean priest studied astrology. But one thing I found when I was researching that was the oldest markings that can be found, cave markings in France, they're 26,000 years old. Okay, so we're talking quite old, 26,000 years old, and of the sun and moon cycles, the lunar cycle, basically. Presumably because they needed to know not when the moon was void its course, but when the moon was going to be full and they could actually see at night. And also as a way to count the seasons, I suppose. But 26,000 years old. So,
there's a lot of interesting archaeoastronomy stuff with things like that, or like Stonehenge and that being oriented towards the solstices and the equinoxes, which of course later became the basis of the tropical zodiac. For people that are interested in the history of astrology, though, my 2 favorite books I'd recommend are, one, A History of Horoscopic Astrology by James Holden, which is my favorite book on the history of astrology.
I actually think I have that on my shelf and I haven't read it yet.
It's really good.
Okay.
It focuses on like telling the history very concisely based on especially telling you who the major astrologers were in any
Yeah.
era. So it's like it has a few page section on William Lilly and
Okay.
what his book was about and why he's important, or it has a few page section on, you know, Claudius Ptolemy or Abu Mashar or some of the other astrologers we've talked about here.
Yeah.
So that's a really good one.
Yeah.
The other good one is Nicholas Campion and his 2-volume series titled A History of Western Astrology, volumes 1 and 2. So if
Okay.
people want to learn more about the history, I'd definitely recommend checking those out.
Yeah. Okay. I will. Because I'm
Cool.
getting more and more interested. I've always, you know, thought of myself as a really hardcore modern astrologer, but I'm more and more interested in all this. So.
All right. Well, have you read my book? Hellenistic
No, I will be
Astrology?
reading your book, and
All
I'll
right.
be having you on my radio show to talk about it, please.
I might need to send you a copy then, so you'll have to send me your.
Oh, no, I'd be delighted to buy it with pleasure. I'll buy it from Amazon or somewhere less politically incorrect.
Yeah, find bookstores everywhere. Well, in the UK,
they're all closed.
I'm trying to think of is it Treadwell's, I think, is the...
Treadwell's, we've got Daunt books, we've got Waterstones, but I'll buy it and I'll read it with great interest.
Watkins, that's my favorite.
Watkins, yes,
Watkins is amazing. They've always done a very good job of when my book came out.
And they're almost certainly online now as well.
Yeah. All right, cool. Well, thanks a lot for joining me today. Thanks, again, for this invitation and for having this conversation with me. I appreciate it. Yeah, this is perfect. And thanks to everybody for listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast or Yasmin's show, wherever you're listening to this. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you again next time. Special thanks to the patrons who supported the production of this episode of the Astrology Podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to the patrons on our producers tier, including Nate Craddock, Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Michelle Marilot, Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Sumo Kopic, Nadia Habhab, and Issa Sabah. For more information about how to become a patron and get access to bonus content such as early access to new episodes, visit patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Also, special thanks to our sponsors, including the Northwest Astrological Conference, which is happening online May 27th through the 31st, 2021. Find out more information at norwac.net. The Mountain Astrologer magazine, which you can find out more information about at mountainastrologer.com. The Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs, which you can find out more information about at honeycomb.co. Also, the Portland School of Astrology, more information at portlandastrology.org. The AstroGold Astrology app, available for both iPhone and Android, available at astrogold.io. And finally, the primary software program that we use on episodes of the Astrology Podcast is called SolarFire Astrology Software, which is available at alabe.com, and you can get a 15% discount with the promo code AP15.